Death row inmate Mason Hale spent 9 years in a room without wind, without the presence of another soul. The heavy steel door opened only twice a day to deliver meals, and not a single visitor ever came, not even those willing to forgive. His official record read, "No contact with family, no participation in rehabilitation, no request for sentence reduction, no speech for 6 consecutive years." So when he unexpectedly submitted a request for a final wish, the entire facility fell silent. The warden read it aloud, thinking it must have been an error. "I want to see Max again, the dog I abandoned." No request to call his mother, no request for a final meal, no alcohol, no cigarettes. Just the wish to look once more into the eyes of a living being he had once cast aside with his own hands. Most called it madness. But one person, Nora Whitman, a quiet administrative clerk, didn't laugh. She simply folded the paper and began searching. And while others saw his request as meaningless, a quiet act of redemption had already begun. Before prison, Mason Hale had lived an ordinary life, part-time job at a lumber mill, a small wooden house on the forest's edge, and most importantly, Max, a golden rescue dog he had adopted from the local shelter on the first snowy day of 2010. At the time, Max was small, skinny, and constantly trembling. Mason, too, was in recovery, still carrying the guilt of the car crash that had taken his father's life, a crash he had been behind the wheel for. "You and me, Max. We've both been left behind," Mason had whispered on that first night, carrying the puppy home inside his jacket. For the next 2 years, they were inseparable. Mason taught Max to sit, wait, spin in circles. Max taught Mason silence and patience. The once cold cabin came alive with the sound of paws tapping across the floor and Mason's low chuckle whenever Max clumsily collided with the furniture, chasing after a toy bone. But then life began to crack. Mason lost his job. His mother passed away. Gambling debts mounted. Alcohol, drugs, and shady deals took root. Max stayed faithfully lying at the door each night, gently nudging Mason's hand each morning. But Mason was no longer there, not the man Max had once known. One winter night, evicted and soaked in the rain, Mason clutched a torn duffel bag. Max stood beside him, drenched and silent. And then, without a word, Mason tied Max to the fence of the same shelter he had once rescued him from. He stepped back and turned away. Max didn't bark, didn't tug at the leash. He simply watched. Mason didn't look back. In that moment, his footsteps left behind his heart. And Max, he didn't forgive, but he didn't chase him either. In cell 7, Mason kept nothing. No books, no letters, no pen or paper. Just one item carefully tucked into a small crack beneath a concrete slab, wrapped in an empty cigarette packet, and folded exactly 8 times a faded photograph, printed from an old film developer, its edges worn and water-stained. The photo had been taken on an autumn afternoon. Mason, his hair still long, beard barely grown, sat on wooden steps in a weathered white t-shirt, one hand resting gently on the head of a small golden puppy. The puppy looked into the camera, tail-curled eyes bright as if smiling. Mason's left hand held a stick. His right lay loosely across Max's back. Both of them still whole. The picture had been taken by an old friend exactly 3 days before Mason abandoned Max at the shelter. By then he was already drinking heavily, deep in debt, and aware that he could no longer save himself. But Max didn't know. He simply sat beside him, looking into the lens, as if trying to preserve something, as if he somehow sensed it would be the last time he got to call someone master. Mason carried that photo with him for 9 years in prison, folded 8 times to hide more easily, or maybe to look at less, to hurt less. Each night he unfolded it, stared for 5 seconds, and then folded it again. Just 5 seconds, like a small dose of medicine to preserve the last human part of a soul that had been silent for too long. Throughout his 9 years on death row, Mason Hale never once submitted a special request. No paper or pen, no family visit, no last meal. He became a forgotten name, so much so that staff referred to Cell 7 simply as the silent room. So when a guard received a form signed faintly by Mason, he assumed it was a system error. The note contained just one line. "If Max is still alive, I'd like to see him one last time. No need to come close. Just seeing him is enough. No explanation. No time specified. No further conditions. Just one sentence quiet, as if it had been carried across 1,000 sleepless nights without ever daring to be spoken." At first, the administration intended to deny the request. The official reason: security risk. Not an approved family contact. But Nora, the young clerk, the only one who could say Mason's name without hesitation, whispered, after reading the note, "I used to work at an animal shelter. Dogs don't forget people. It's just, we assume they do." She didn't wait for formal approval. That night she went home, turned on her computer, and searched every shelter within a 500-mile radius. She typed the exact name Max Hale, the name under which Mason had registered the dog's microchip in 2011. On the 17th website, she got a result: male Labrador, 1 eye blind, slight limp in left leg. Name Max. Shelter, Lincoln, Nebraska. Nora printed the photo and laid it in front of Mason the next morning. She didn't say a word. Mason took the paper, his hand trembling, but his eyes still cold. Then he turned away. A few seconds later, Nora heard a sound she had never heard in all her years working at the prison: a long exhale. Like a man finally breathing out the last piece of his buried humanity. The side gate to solitary confinement opened for the first time in 3 years. The afternoon light spilled across the worn concrete floor, casting a pale silver streak like a strip of memory. Max stepped through, not in a rush, not barking, not tugging at the leash. His left leg dragged slightly, but his posture still carried something like dignity. The gait of someone who had been left behind, but had never truly fallen. At the far end of the corridor, Mason Hale stood against the wall, hands behind his back, face unreadable, but his chest rising and falling for the first time in 9 years. Max stopped about 5 paces away from him. He didn't come closer, didn't bark, didn't react. No, he recognized him, but he didn't forgive. Mason lowered his head and slowly crouched down, as if trying to make himself smaller. He didn't speak, didn't call his name, didn't reach out. He just looked deeply and silently. "I don't deserve to say your name. I used to be your master. But now, I'm just someone who failed you." These words weren't spoken aloud, but they were written clearly in Mason's eyes, and the audience would feel them. Max looked back at him for a long time. His vision had faded, but there was something in his gaze, as if he recognized not by sight, but by soul. Slowly he sat, just as he had once done years ago on the porch of their old cabin. He didn't move forward, but he didn't turn away either. 10 minutes passed. No words, no gestures. Only a man waiting to be forgiven, and a creature who had once been left behind, but still remembered the way back. When Nora returned, she asked softly, "Do you want me to take him outside now?" Mason shook his head. "No. Let him sit there. That's already more than I ever expected." There was no line in the prison regulations that allowed for this. But that night, Mason and Max were permitted to stay in the same room, a disused interrogation room, with no cameras, no handcuffs, no guards. Just the dim spill of yellow light from a flickering ceiling bulb and the sound of slow breathing like the final steps of a long walk. Max lay at the foot of the table. Mason sat in the corner back against the wall, one arm resting on his knee. For the first 2 hours, neither of them moved. Only the ticking clock inside Mason's head counted down to the next morning, and the faint scrape of Max's nails against the tile, as if he was reminding himself to stay awake, because this dream wouldn't last long. By the 3rd hour, Mason shifted slightly closer, not too close, just enough to let the light cast a soft glow on Max's back. He sat there. No deep breaths. No calling out. Just gently placed the old 8-folded photograph on the floor and pushed it toward the dog. Max opened his eyes, glanced at it slowly, then did nothing. But a minute later, he moved, lowered his muzzle, and rested it precisely on the corner of the photo. He didn't bite, didn't growl, just lay there as if to say, "I've seen it. I remember, and I'm holding it one last time." Mason began to cry. Not with sobs, not with moans, just silent tears falling soundlessly. His hand reached out and touched Max's back for the first time since the day he left him at the shelter gate. No one had taught Max how to lie still like that. But he stayed still, rested his head on Mason's lap, as if there had never been a goodbye. 3 hours later, Mason said the only words of the night: "I don't dare ask you to forgive me. But if you're here, then you haven't left me. Thank you." Max didn't move. He simply exhaled softly and drifted to sleep as if he knew tonight was enough. The next morning, when the guards opened the door, they found Mason still sitting in the same position. Dark circles under his eyes, and Max sleeping peacefully, with his head on Mason's lap like a tired pup who had wandered far and finally come home. The next morning, no alarm, no shouting, no urgency. Only a quiet officer arriving to unlock room 3, the room where Max had spent the night with Mason. The door creaked open, sunlight cutting diagonally into the worn space. Max had already awakened. So had Mason. Yet neither had moved from their place. As if for one final night, they had been allowed to exist in a world without sentences or punishment. The guard gave a signal. Max rose slowly, needing no leash from Nora. He turned back to look at Mason once without blinking. No bark, no growl, no expression. Only those aged, deep eyes holding what seemed like an ocean of things that words could never contain. Mason didn't speak. He only bowed his head. For the first time in his life, he accepted a truth: I may not be someone who deserves forgiveness, but I'm no longer someone who runs. Max walked toward the exit. The threshold was worn wood, the chipped silver paint on the iron door flaking with time. Just before stepping out, he paused. For exactly 1 second. Then, in a motion so slow it etched itself into memory, Max turned his head, bit down on the collar Nora had placed on him at the rescue center, and dropped it on the tile right at the threshold. The collar hit the floor with a tiny metallic clink. But in the silence of that room, it sounded like a final declaration: I've come back. But I will no longer wear what once tied me to abandonment. I'm giving it back to you. What happens next is yours to decide. Mason bent down and picked up the collar. He didn't kiss it, didn't clutch it to his chest, didn't cry. He simply gripped it tightly in his hand, as if holding onto a life that was slowly slipping from reach. As Max walked away, Mason rose, standing fully upright for the first time in 9 years, not to appear strong, but because in his hands he now carried a promise, not one made to anyone else but to himself. That morning, after Max was taken away, Nora Whitman sat alone in the administrative office, staring at the computer screen as the countdown clock ticked steadily toward the scheduled time for Mason Hale's execution, an hour set 3 years earlier. Everything was moving according to protocol except her heart. In front of her was a blank sheet of paper labeled faintly at the top Form 17A, Emergency Request to Postpone Execution, to be used only in cases of medical crisis, legal appeal, or psychological disorder. Nora was neither a doctor nor a lawyer, just someone who had once lost her own dog of 11 years, on the same day she refused to let him onto her bed one last time. She thought about the night before when she had seen Mason sitting motionless, Max resting his head on his lap like a silent ember gone to sleep. There had been no handcuffs, no guards, no restraints, but somehow in that fragile stillness, it had felt more lawful than any sentence she had ever processed. Taking a breath, she typed slowly, "Request to postpone execution of inmate Mason Hale for 48 hours. Reason subject is undergoing a significant psychological shift. New signs of cognitive presence observed. Requesting extended monitoring to evaluate behavioral development." She didn't submit it through the prison's official system. Instead, she printed 3 copies, sealed them in a marked envelope, and mailed them directly to the governor's office. She knew she was breaking procedure. She also knew she might be suspended by the next day. But some verdicts aren't written in codes or statutes, they live in the human part of us that believes sometimes all someone needs is one more day to find their way back. No one knows exactly how, but a photo from the night Mason and Max shared a room surfaced online the same day the postponement request reached the governor's desk. The image, black and white, unedited, showed a man in a prison uniform sitting against a wall and an old dog blind in one eye resting its head on his lap. No one was smiling. No one was crying. Just the quiet spill of yellow light casting the shadows of 2 bodies, 2 souls that had clearly walked a very long road together. The photo had first been shared by Carlos, a janitor who had paused outside the room and snapped the moment quietly, saying only that it was too beautiful to keep to myself. He added no caption. But within 24 hours, the post had been shared more than 5 million times, and someone anonymous added a single sentence that turned the image into something unforgettable. Not forgiven, but never left. That's Max. The media erupted. ABC, NBC, The New York Times, The Guardian, Le Monde journalists unearthed Max's records, the dog abandoned 9 years earlier. They dug into Mason Hale's history, a death row inmate who had never once asked for clemency. They found the grainy CCTV footage from the morning Max dropped his collar at the cell door, and they went silent. Public opinion surged. A man condemned to die, but a dog still chose to keep him alive. If Max didn't abandon him, who are we to carry out the sentence? Forgiveness doesn't mean saying, "I forgot." It means saying, "I'm still here." Meanwhile, in Cell 7, Mason remained unaware. He had no internet, no contact. But that afternoon when Nora visited, she left behind only a single sheet of paper, a black and white printout of the first article that had published the photo of him and Max. It had no title, no byline, just a quiet line printed at the bottom. A person may not be worthy of society, but can still be worthy of the loyalty of a creature that never learned to speak. That afternoon, a light rain fell. The window of Cell 7 had fogged over from the moisture, but Mason still stood there motionless, both hands resting on the bars. He wasn't looking out toward freedom. He was facing west, the direction of the road that led to where Max had been taken. Since morning, he hadn't eaten, hadn't spoken. The guards thought he was on a hunger strike. But in truth, Mason was waiting for something inside him to find the courage to speak. In his hand was the old collar, the one Max had removed and left behind on the day they said goodbye. The metal was worn, the engraved name nearly scratched away. But when Mason held it against his chest, the entire world fell silent. And then softly, almost too faint for anyone to hear, he said, "Max." For the first time in 9 years, a name passed through human lips, not in the voice of a criminal, not that of a prisoner, but the voice of a father, a friend, someone who had once lost everything and now could only hold on to a name to hold on to himself. He closed his eyes, pressed his forehead to the bars, and whispered, "You remembered the way back, Max, and I forgot how to be human. But if you've forgiven me just by returning, then maybe I can forgive myself." Starting today, no reply came. But Mason stood upright. His hand gripped the collar as though it were a promise to the small soul he had once abandoned. And in that moment, Nora, standing in the hallway outside, having overheard by chance, began to cry. Not because of the name Mason had spoken, but because of how he spoke it, like there had never been a wall thick enough to keep a heart from reaching a voice. He, governor's office, had never processed a stay of execution request based on a reason that fell outside legal grounds. There was no mental illness, no new evidence, no intervention from legal counsel. Only a thin case file accompanied by a black and white photograph with a handwritten note that read, "The inmate has begun to exhibit behavioral changes that do not fit within any standard form. Requesting additional time for evaluation not of the crime but of the man." Signed, Nora Whitman. Title: Administrative Clerk, Mid-Level Correctional Facility. At first the request was marked for review later. But that afternoon, a young legal aide in the governor's office, while re-examining the file, saw the name Max and paused. "Isn't that the dog from the photo that's gone viral nationwide?" 2 hours later, the governor himself asked for the case to be reopened. No one understood why he sat silently for 15 minutes staring at a single photograph. Then he said, "If a dog can still believe people are capable of change, I refuse to be the one person who doesn't." And with that, a signature was placed. It didn't pardon. It didn't erase the crime. Just one quiet line beneath the final review section: execution postponed indefinitely. Comprehensive reassessment to be conducted within 180 days. Forgiveness may take longer than death. The news was delivered to the prison that evening. Mason was called in and handed the official notice by the warden. He read it. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply whispered, "Max, you spoke for me," without saying a word. 3 months after the execution was postponed, Mason Hale didn't return home. He didn't request release, didn't accept interviews, didn't negotiate with the media. Instead, he submitted a volunteer application to the Lincoln Animal Rescue Center, the same place that had sheltered Max for 5 years. People assumed he was applying for a supervisor position or a role in the rehabilitation program. But he wasn't. Mason asked to work unpaid night shifts doing just one job: cleaning kennels. On his first day at the shelter, it rained. He arrived wearing an old coat and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Yet the director recognized him immediately, not because of his name, but because of his eyes they had once seen in a one-eyed dog who used to lie quietly by the gate waiting for someone to come back. Mason didn't speak much. He carried buckets of water, gathered dirty blankets, refilled food bowls, wiped up urine, and cleaned kennels. And every night before leaving, he would stop by each dog's cage, sit down, and whisper quietly, "I know what it feels like to be left behind. I used to be the one who walked away, but now I'll be the one who stays." A month later, a small puppy was brought in abandoned on the side of the highway. Its back left leg was deformed, and a faint scar ran over one eye. The staff planned to transfer it to a larger shelter, assuming no one would take it. But Mason stood, lifted the pup gently into his arms. It licked his hand, then rested its head on his shoulder, just like Max did on his first night at the prison. "I'll take this one," Mason said. "Not as an adopter, but as redemption. I once abandoned a dog, and now I won't let another one go through that. Some stories don't need a grand finale. They don't require courtrooms or tears or erased records. Sometimes all it takes is a name spoken again, a caller no longer forgotten, and a dog who never learned to speak, but never once turned away. Mason never asked for forgiveness. Max never demanded to be loved again. But the silence between them had already said everything. Thank you for staying until the very end. Maybe you've made mistakes. Maybe you're still waiting for someone to return. Or maybe you too once had a Max in your life, a person, a dog, or a memory. And if this story touched something within you, then perhaps forgiveness doesn't always begin with words. Sometimes it begins with the simple fact that you're still here. If you believe in stories of unspoken love, quiet redemption, and second chances, subscribe and walk with us on the journeys yet to come. And remember, you don't need everyone to understand you. Somewhere out there, there's always a creature who still remembers the way back to you. If this story stayed with you even just a little, consider subscribing to the channel. We tell stories that don't shout but stay. About quiet love, silent forgiveness, and the kind of second chances that don't come with applause, just the sound of someone finally finding their way home. Your support helps us keep telling them.